Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we follow a farmer preparing for a harvest festival near Whiterun. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. The first light of morning came slowly to the plains outside Whiterun, creeping across the tundra grass in shades of pearl and amber. The young farmer woke to the sound of roosters calling from the coop behind the farmhouse, their voices cutting through the cool summer air. She lay still for a moment, feeling the warmth of her husband beside her, listening to the familiar sounds of home. From the room beyond the thin wooden wall came the gentle snoring of her father, a sound as constant as the wind that swept down from the throat of the world. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake her husband just yet. The floorboards were cool beneath her feet, worn smooth by generations of farmers who had worked this land before her family had claimed it. Through the small window she could see the fields stretching away toward the stone walls of Whiterun, the barley, heavy and golden, ready for harvest. Or it should have been ready. She frowned slightly, remembering yesterday's rain and the day before that, and the week before that. The fields were sodden, the earth dark and waterlogged. The harvest festival was only 10 days away, and the barley needed to be cut and dried before then. She dressed quietly in her work clothes, the rough spun tunic and trousers that had been patched many times over. The fabric held the smell of earth and grain and honest labour. Downstairs she stirred the embers in the hearth and added kindling, coaxing flames to life. The fire crackled and popped, filling the small kitchen with warmth and flickering light. She filled the kettle from the water bucket and hung it over the flames, then stepped outside into the dawn. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing things. Mist clung to the hollows between the rows of barley, and the grass sparkled with dew. The two dogs came bounding up from their sleeping spot by the barn, tails wagging, tongues lolling. She scratched their ears and spoke softly to them, and they pressed against her legs in greeting before racing off to make their morning patrol of the property. Good dogs. They kept the foxes away from the chickens and raised alarm if anything larger came sniffing around. She made her way to the chicken coop, a sturdy structure her grandfather had built from stone and timber. The hens clucked softly as she entered, shifting on their roosts. She scattered grain for them and checked the nesting boxes, finding 6 brown eggs still warm from the birds. She placed them carefully in her basket, thanking the hens as her mother had taught her to do. Everything on a farm deserved gratitude, her mother had always said. The animals, the crops, the earth itself, they gave so that people could live. Her mother had been gone 3 years now, taken by a fever one hard winter. The farm felt emptier without her, though her father still worked as hard as his aging body would allow, and her husband had proven himself worth 10 men when it came to the heavy labour. Still, she missed her mother's presence in the kitchen, her wisdom about which herbs to plant and when to harvest. Her stories about the old days before the Civil War had touched even this quiet corner of Skyrim. The barn stood solid against the lightening sky, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, the old horse lifted his head from his hay and nickered softly. She approached him slowly, running her hand along his neck. His coat was rough beneath her fingers, his bones more prominent than they had been even a season ago. He had been a good horse, strong and patient, but he was old now, perhaps 20 years or more. Her father said it was time to think about replacing him, and she knew he was right. The spring ploughing had been hard on the old fellow, and autumn ploughing would come soon after the harvest. A younger, stronger horse would make the work easier for everyone. She fed him a measure of oats and checked his water, then stood for a moment in the quiet of the barn, listening to him chew. The smell of hay and horse and old wood was comforting, familiar. This barn had sheltered her family's animals for as long as anyone could remember. The beams overhead were dark with age and smoke, carved with marks from 3 generations of farmers tallying their harvests. Outside again, she walked to the edge of the barley field and knelt, pressing her hand into the soil. It squelched beneath her palm, water seeping up between her fingers. Too wet, much too wet. The barley could not be harvested like this. The stalks would mat and tangle, the grain would be muddy, and worst of all, the cartwheels would sink deep into the soft earth, making the work impossible. She stood and brushed her hand on her trousers, looking up at the sky. It was clear now, pale blue and cloudless. Perhaps today would be dry. Perhaps tomorrow. She could only wait and hope. Back at the house, smoke was rising from the chimney, and she could hear movement inside. Her father would be up now, and her husband too. She returned to the kitchen to find them both at the table, her father's weathered hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, her husband building up the fire. They greeted her with nods and quiet morning words, the easy familiarity of people who had lived and worked together for years. She prepared breakfast while they discussed the day's work. Porridge with honey, bread from yesterday's baking, the fresh eggs fried in butter. Simple food, but it filled the belly and gave strength for the labour ahead. Her father ate slowly, his jaw working carefully. He had lost teeth over the years, and eating had become more difficult for him, though he never complained. He had been born on this farm, had worked it his entire life, and would likely die here when his time came. There was a quiet dignity in that, she thought. A life lived in one place, roots growing deep. After breakfast, her husband went out to repair a section of fence that the dogs had been squeezing through, and her father settled into his chair to mend harness leather. She cleaned the dishes and swept the floor, then took up her mending basket. There were always clothes that needed attention, tears to stitch, buttons to replace, hems to let down or take up. Her hands moved with practiced ease, the needle flashing in the light from the window. Around midday she prepared a simple meal of bread and cheese and yesterday's stew, warmed over the fire. They ate together at the table, talking about the wet fields and what needed to be done if the weather held. Her husband suggested they could start sharpening the scythes and checking the harvest tools, making sure everything was ready for when the fields dried enough. Her father agreed, nodding slowly. Always better to be prepared, he said. The festival would not wait for them. After the meal, she decided to walk into Whiterun. They needed a few supplies from the market, and she wanted to speak with the stable master about horses. The old horse would need to be replaced soon, and it was better to look early and find a good animal than to wait until desperation forced a poor choice. She put on her better tunic, the one without patches, and pulled her hair back with a leather cord. Her husband offered to come with her, but she shook her head. He was needed here, and besides, she enjoyed the walk alone sometimes, the chance to think her own thoughts without the constant demands of farm work. The road to Whiterun was well travelled, packed earth that had been walked by countless feet over countless years. She passed other farms as she walked, calling greetings to neighbours working in their yards or fields. Everyone was in the same situation, waiting for the ground to dry, hoping the weather would hold. The harvest festival was important to all of them, a chance to sell their grain and livestock, to trade with merchants from other holds, to celebrate the summer's work with music and dancing and good food. As she walked, she noticed a patrol of Whiterun guards heading back toward the city, their armour gleaming in the afternoon sun. One of them called out to her, warning her to stay close to the road. There had been reports of a giant spotted near the farms to the west, he said, probably wandering down from the mountains looking for mammoths. Nothing to worry about too much, but best to be careful. She thanked him and continued on, feeling a small flutter of unease. Giants were usually peaceful enough if you left them alone, but they were enormous and could be dangerous if startled or provoked. The walls of Whiterun rose before her, ancient stone that had stood for thousands of years. The main gate stood open as always during daylight, guards posted on either side. She passed through into the city, into the bustle and noise and smell of many people living close together. It was so different from the quiet of the farm. Merchants called out their wares. Children ran laughing through the streets. A bard was playing somewhere nearby, his voice rising and falling with some old ballad about dragons and heroes. She made her way through the Wind district toward the market, dodging carts and groups of people deep in conversation. A mage walked past her, robes swirling, hands crackling faintly with frost magic. She had never understood magic, never felt that pull toward it that some people described. Her magic was in the earth, in coaxing life from seeds, in knowing when to plant and when to harvest. That was enough for her. At the market, she purchased the supplies she needed: salt, flour, a small jar of oil for the lamps. The merchants were friendly, asking after her family, discussing the weather and the upcoming festival. Everyone had the same concerns, the same hopes. She bartered 24 eggs for a sack of feed for the chickens, pleased with the trade. The feed would last a month at least, and the neighbour woman who kept cows always needed eggs for her baking. Finally, she made her way to the stables outside the main gate. The stable master was a gruff man with capable hands and an eye for good horses. She explained her situation, and he showed her 2 animals that might suit her needs. One was a sturdy mare, young and strong, but somewhat spirited. The other was a gelding, older but calm and steady. Both would cost more than her family could easily afford, but a farm needed a good horse. She told the stable master she would discuss it with her husband and father, and return in a few days with an answer. The walk home was peaceful, the sun warm on her shoulders. She saw a dragon in the distance, just a dark shape against the clouds, flying south toward the mountains. Once, such a sight would have sent her running for cover, but dragons had become almost common these past months. As long as they stayed in the sky and minded their own business, people had learned to live with them, just as they lived with wolves and bears and all the other dangers of Skyrim. By the time she reached the farm, the sun was lowering toward the western horizon, painting the plains in shades of gold and orange. Her husband was in the barn, and her father was sitting outside the house, watching the light fade. She told them about the horses, and they discussed the options over dinner. The mare would be better for heavy work, they agreed, but the gelding would be easier to handle. They would think on it more and decide in a day or 2. As darkness fell, they sat together by the fire, tired from the day's work but content. Outside, the dogs barked once at some sound in the night, then fell silent. The chickens were locked safely in their coop. The old horse rested in his stall. The fields lay waiting, wet but patient, and overhead the stars came out one by one, the same stars that had watched over this land since before the first farmers had broken the soil. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, and they would face it as farmers always had, with steady hands and strong backs, and the deep knowledge that the earth would provide, if given time and care and respect. Morning came with clearer skies and a wind that promised drying. The young farmer woke before dawn again, slipping from beneath the warm blankets to begin another day. Her husband stirred but did not wake, and she dressed quietly in the grey light filtering through the window. Her father was already awake. She could hear him moving about in his room, the soft shuffle of his feet on the wooden floor, the creak of his old bones as he prepared himself for the day. The kitchen was cold, the fire having died to ashes overnight. She rebuilt it patiently, arranging kindling in a careful pyramid, nursing the first small flames until they caught and grew. The kettle went on, and while the water heated, she stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air felt different today, drier, with less of the heavy dampness that had hung over everything for weeks. Perhaps the fields would begin to dry, perhaps they would be able to harvest soon. The dogs greeted her with their usual enthusiasm, and she sent them on their rounds while she tended to the chickens. The hens were laying well this time of year, and she gathered 8 eggs, warm and smooth in her hands. One of the hens had gone broody, sitting determinedly on her nest, and the farmer left her be. They could use more chickens, and fresh chicks in late summer would grow strong before winter came. In the barn, the old horse stood with his head low, resting. She checked him carefully, running her hands over his legs, feeling for heat or swelling. He seemed well enough, though his breathing was heavier than it should be. She fed him his oats and gave him fresh water, speaking softly to him all the while. He had been a good friend to her family, this old horse. Replacing him felt like a betrayal, even though she knew it was necessary, even though she knew he would be happier retired to a light life of grazing and rest. Her father was in the kitchen when she returned, standing at the window and looking out over the fields. The sun was rising now, spreading golden light across the tundra, and in that light the barley seemed to glow. He turned when she entered, and she saw the hope in his lined face. "Might be dry enough by tomorrow," he said, his voice rough from sleep, "if the wind holds." They breakfasted on porridge and eggs and talked about the work that needed doing. The scythes did need sharpening, her father insisted, and the harvest baskets needed checking for damage. The cartwheels should be greased, and they would need to clear space in the barn for storing the grain once it was cut. Her husband came down as they were finishing the meal, his hair tousled, his eyes still half closed with sleep. He was not a morning person, but he never complained, simply ate his breakfast and got to work. The day passed in steady labour. Her husband and father worked on the tools while she tended the garden behind the house, pulling weeds and checking the vegetables. They grew cabbage and leeks and potatoes, turnips and carrots, herbs for cooking and healing. The garden was her domain, and she took pride in keeping it neat and productive. The soil here was good, dark and rich, and things grew well if you cared for them properly. By midday the sun was hot overhead, and she could see the wet gleam fading from the fields. The wind had picked up, gusting across the plains, bending the barley in long waves. It was beautiful, in its way, the golden stalks moving like water, rippling and flowing under the invisible hand of the wind. She stood at the garden's edge and watched it, feeling a deep sense of connection to this place, this land that fed them and sustained them. Her husband called to her from the barn, and she went to help him grease the cartwheels. It was messy work, their hands black with the thick grease, but necessary. A squeaking wheel would drive them mad during harvest, and worse, a wheel that seized up could ruin everything. They worked together in comfortable silence, only speaking when necessary, their movements coordinated from years of working side by side. In the afternoon, a neighbour stopped by, an older woman whose farm lay to the south. She had come to trade milk and cheese for eggs, and the two women sat at the kitchen table while her father and husband continued their work outside. The neighbour was full of news, as she always was. The blacksmith in Whiterun had taken a new apprentice, a young woman from Rorikstead. The Jarl was planning something special for the Harvest Festival this year, extra entertainers and competitions, and the giant that had been spotted near the western farms was still there, apparently setting up camp with 2 mammoths. "Should we be worried?" the farmer asked, thinking of her chickens and her old horse, neither of which would be much of a match for an angry giant. The neighbour woman shook her head. "The guards are keeping an eye on it. As long as it stays where it is and doesn't bother anyone, they'll leave it be. You know how giants are. Peaceful enough if you don't threaten their mammoths." Still, the farmer felt uneasy. Giants were unpredictable, and harvest time would bring many people out to the fields, lots of noise and activity. She hoped the creature would move on before then, wander back to the mountains where it belonged. After the neighbour left, she prepared the evening meal, a stew of mutton and vegetables that had been simmering slowly all day. The smell filled the house, rich and savoury, and when they sat down to eat, everyone was hungry from the day's work. They ate well, sopping up the stew with chunks of bread, and her father complimented her cooking as he always did. Small rituals, small kindnesses, they mattered. As the sun set, her husband suggested they walk out to the fields to check the soil. She agreed, and they left her father dozing by the fire, the dogs at his feet. The evening air was cooling, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze. They walked between the rows of barley, the stalks brushing against their legs, and knelt to test the earth. It was still damp, but not nearly as wet as it had been. Another day or 2 of sun and wind, and they might be able to start cutting. "We should decide about the horse," her husband said as they walked back toward the house. "If we're going to buy before the festival, we need to do it soon. Everyone will be looking for good animals, and the prices will go up." She nodded, knowing he was right. "The gelding," she said after a moment. "He seemed more suited to us. Steady and calm. We don't need a spirited horse, we need one that will work reliably." Her husband agreed, and they decided he would go into Whiterun the next day to speak with the stable master, see if they could negotiate a fair price. It would take most of their savings, but a good horse was an investment that would pay back over years, and the old horse deserved his retirement. That night, lying in bed with her husband's breathing slow and steady beside her, she thought about the days ahead. The harvest, the festival, the new horse, the changing seasons. Life on a farm was a cycle, endlessly repeating yet always slightly different. Each year brought its own challenges and joys, its own rhythms and patterns. She had been born to this life, had never wanted anything else, and lying there in the darkness, listening to the wind outside and the small sounds of the house settling, she felt deeply content. The 3rd morning dawned bright and clear, the sky a perfect summer blue, unmarred by even a single cloud. The young farmer woke with a sense of anticipation, knowing that today her husband would go to Whiterun to negotiate for the new horse. They had counted their coins the night before, laying them out on the table in small stacks. It was enough, just barely, if the stable master would be reasonable. If not, they would have to wait, perhaps sell some of the harvest first and buy a horse afterward. Her husband left after breakfast, walking the road to Whiterun with a small pouch of coins at his belt and their hopes riding on his shoulders. She watched him go, then turned her attention to the day's work. Her father was already checking the fields, walking slowly between the rows, bending now and then to press his hand into the soil. When he returned to the house, he was smiling. "Tomorrow," he said. "We can start tomorrow. The ground is nearly dry." The relief she felt was profound. They had been waiting so long, watching the days tick past, worrying about the festival deadline. But tomorrow they would harvest, and if the weather held, they would finish in time. She went to the fields herself to verify what her father had found. And yes, the earth was firmer now, the wet gleam gone, the mud beginning to crack and harden in the sun. She spent the morning preparing for the harvest. She checked every basket, mending two that had splits in their weaving. She oiled the handles of the scythes until they were smooth and comfortable to grip. She laid out the cloths they would use to wrap the grain bundles, inspecting each for holes or weakness. Everything had to be ready, because once they started, they would work from dawn until dark, racing to get the crop in before weather or pests or bad luck could ruin it. Around midday, she heard the dogs barking and looked up to see a guard from Whiterun riding up the path to the farm. Her heart clenched with sudden fear. Had something happened to her husband? But the guard was smiling as he dismounted, and he raised a hand in friendly greeting. He had come to warn them, he said, that the Jarl was organising a hunting party to drive the giant away from the western farms. It would happen tomorrow, and there might be some noise and commotion. Best to keep livestock close and doors locked, just as a precaution. She thanked him for the warning and offered him water, which he accepted gratefully. They talked for a few minutes about the upcoming harvest and the festival, and then he rode back toward the city, his armour bright in the midday sun. She watched him go, feeling grateful for the warning, but also anxious. A giant hunt was dangerous business. People could be hurt, or worse. She hoped the giant would simply leave on its own, wander back to wherever it had come from. But giants were stubborn creatures, not easily moved. Her father insisted on cleaning out the barn, preparing space for the harvested grain. She helped him, sweeping years of accumulated dust and chaff from the corners, checking the roof for leaks, making sure the space was dry and secure. The old horse watched them work, his large eyes patient and mild. He had spent his life in this barn, she realised, had foaled here perhaps, had grown from a gangly colt to a strong working horse to the elderly animal he was now. This place was his home as much as it was theirs. In the late afternoon she saw her husband returning from Whiterun, and she hurried out to meet him. His face was tired but pleased, and when he reached her, he took her hands in his. "We have a horse," he said. "The stable master agreed to our price. We can collect him the day after tomorrow." She felt joy bubble up in her chest and she squeezed his hands tight. "The gelding?" "The gelding," he confirmed. "And the stable master said he would take our old fellow, let him live out his days in a good paddock with light work. He has a farm boy who needs a gentle horse to learn on." It seemed right. It did seem right. She had been dreading the thought of selling the old horse to someone who might work him too hard, or worse, send him to the knacker. But this way, he would have a peaceful end to his life, teaching a young person the ways of horses, grazing in green grass, loved and cared for. She blinked back tears, surprised by the strength of her emotion. That evening, they celebrated with a special meal. She had been saving a bottle of wine, a gift from her mother's sister who lived in solitude, and she opened it now, pouring small cups for the three of them. They toasted to the new horse, to the coming harvest, to the family and the farm, and the good fortune that had blessed them. Her father's eyes were bright, and he told stories from his youth, tales of harvests past, of the year the entire crop had been lost to blight, of the year they had reaped twice what they expected and had been able to buy 2 new cows. As darkness fell and the fire burned low, the farmer stepped outside for a moment alone. The stars were brilliant overhead. The constellations her mother had taught her to recognize spread across the night sky. The thief, the warrior, the mage, the 3 guardian stones. She had never visited the standing stones herself. had never felt called to pledge herself to any of the three paths. Her path was here, on this land, and that was enough. A sound made her turn, and she saw both dogs staring toward the western fields, their ears pricked forward, their bodies tense. She strained her eyes in the darkness, but saw nothing. Perhaps they had heard the giant far off across the plains. Perhaps they sensed the mammoths that travelled with it. She called them to her, and they came reluctantly, still glancing back over their shoulders. She led them inside and shut the door firmly, feeling better with the solid wood between her family and whatever dangers lurked in the night. The fourth day began with distant sounds, shouts and horns carrying faintly across the plains from the west. The giant hunt had begun. The young farmer stood at the edge of her property, listening, her stomach tight with worry. Her husband stood beside her, and her father had come out as well, leaning on his walking stick, his old eyes scanning the horizon. They could see nothing from here. The western farms were too far away, hidden beyond the gentle rolls of the tundra. But they could hear the commotion, the sounds of men and horses and the deep bellowing roar of an angry giant. "They'll be fine," her husband said, though his voice was uncertain. "The guards know what they're doing." They stood together for a long moment, and then her father turned back toward the house. "No point standing here worrying," he said. "We have work to do. The fields are dry. We harvest today." He was right, of course. The farm did not stop for anything, not for giants or dragons or civil wars. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would. They ate a quick breakfast, porridge and yesterday's bread, and then armed themselves with scythes and baskets and went out to the fields. The barley stood tall and golden, the heads heavy with grain. Her father showed her husband how to grip the scythe, how to swing it in long, smooth strokes that cut the stalks cleanly without wasting motion. She followed behind, gathering the cut stalks and binding them into bundles with practiced movements. The work was hard and monotonous, but there was a rhythm to it, a satisfaction in seeing the rows of standing grain transform into neat bundles ready for threshing. The sun climbed higher, beating down on their backs. Sweat soaked through their clothes, and their hands grew sore from gripping the tools. They stopped periodically to drink water and rest, sitting in the shade of the barn, but never for long. There was too much to do, and the day was only so long. Her father worked more slowly than he once had, and she could see the pain in his face when he straightened, his hand going to his lower back. But he did not complain, did not stop, and she felt a fierce pride in him, in his strength and determination. By midday they had cleared perhaps a quarter of the field. The bundles lay in neat rows, and the stubble showed where they had cut. It felt good to see the progress, physical proof of their labour. They ate a simple lunch of cheese and bread and cold meat, sitting in the field itself, too tired to walk back to the house. The dogs lay panting in the shade of the cut stalks, and high overhead a hawk circled, riding the thermal currents. The sounds from the west had faded to occasional distant shouts. The hunt must be moving further away, or perhaps it had ended. She hoped everyone was safe, hoped the giant had been driven off without anyone being hurt. But there was no way to know. Not yet. News would reach them eventually, through neighbours or travellers, or the next time someone went to Whiterun. They worked through the afternoon, their movements growing slower as fatigue set in. Her husband's face was red from the sun despite his hat, and her father was limping slightly, favouring his left leg. She felt the ache in her own shoulders and arms, the strain of repetitive movement. But they kept working because that was what farmers did. The harvest waited for no one. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, her father called a halt. Enough for today, he said, his voice hoarse. We've made good progress. We'll start again tomorrow at dawn. They gathered their tools and walked back to the house, moving slowly, bodies exhausted. She prepared a hearty meal, knowing they all needed the sustenance. Roasted chicken from one of their older hens who had stopped laying, potatoes and carrots from the garden, bread with butter and honey. They ate ravenously, too hungry for much conversation, and afterward her husband and father went straight to bed, falling asleep almost instantly. She stayed up a little longer, banking the fire and preparing things for the morning. Her body ached, but it was a good ache, the pain of honest work accomplished. She stepped outside one last time before bed, breathing the cool night air, and saw lights in the distance toward Whiterun. Torches, perhaps, or a celebration. She wondered what had happened with the giant, whether the hunt had been successful. Tomorrow she would find out. Tomorrow they would harvest more. Tomorrow the new horse would arrive, strong and young, ready to help them with the heavy work that lay ahead. Tomorrow and the day after, and the day after that, until the festival came and they could rest, could celebrate the summer's work and enjoy the fruits of their labour. She went inside and climbed the stairs to the bedroom, where her husband was snoring softly. She undressed and slipped under the blankets, her body sinking into the mattress with relief. Outside, the dogs barked once, then settled. The chickens were safe in their coop. The old horse rested in his stall. The fields lay half-harvested, waiting for dawn, and she closed her eyes and let sleep take her, deep and dreamless and complete. The fifth morning arrived with mist hanging low over the fields, a white blanket that obscured the ground and made the world feel hushed and mysterious. The young farmer woke stiff and sore, her muscles protesting yesterday's labour. Beside her, her husband groaned as he sat up, rolling his shoulders experimentally. They dressed slowly, moving carefully, and made their way downstairs to find her father already up and making tea. Today we get the horse, her husband reminded them, and despite the soreness, the farmer felt a surge of excitement. A new horse meant new possibilities, easier work, a fresh start. After breakfast, her husband would go to Whiterun to collect the gelding and bring back their old horse for one final night in his home barn before his retirement. They worked through the morning, harvesting more of the barley while the mist slowly burned away under the strengthening sun. The rhythm of yesterday returned. Swing and cut, gather and bind, stack and move forward. Row by row the field emptied and the pile of bundled grain grew. Her father's movements were even slower today, and she insisted he take more frequent rests. He grumbled but obeyed, sitting on an upturned bucket in the shade while she and her husband continued the work. Around mid-morning, her husband set down his scythe and headed for Whiterun. She watched him go, then turned back to the field. Her father came to work beside her, and they fell into an easy partnership, his experience guiding her efforts. He told her about harvests from years ago, about the time a storm had come up suddenly and they had worked by lantern light to save the crop, about the year grasshoppers had descended like a plague and eaten half their grain before moving on. "Your mother was fierce that year," he said, his voice fond with memory. She went through the fields with a broom, trying to drive them away. Futile, of course, but she was never one to give up without a fight. The farmer smiled, imagining her mother battling insects with a broom, refusing to yield her farm without resistance. That had been her way, stubborn and strong, gentle and fierce all at once. She missed her mother with a sudden sharp ache, wishing she could share this harvest with her, could show her how well the farm was doing, how strong the family remained even in her absence. They worked until noon, and then she insisted her father rest while she prepared lunch. She made sandwiches of cold meat and cheese and brought them out to the field, where they ate sitting on the stubble, the sun warm on their faces. The dogs sprawled nearby, panting, having given up trying to help and resigned themselves to keeping watch from a distance. It was early afternoon when she spotted her husband returning, leading not one horse but two. The old horse walked beside the new one, and she felt a lump in her throat seeing them together. The old fellow seemed smaller next to the young gelding, more fragile, his age more apparent in contrast to the newcomer's strength. Her husband led them into the yard, and she and her father came to meet them. The new horse was beautiful, she had to admit. Dark bay with a black mane and tail, powerful shoulders and legs, kind eyes that watched them with curiosity but no fear. Her husband introduced them properly, letting the horse sniff their hands, speaking soothingly. The gelding's name was Stormhoof, the stable master had called him, though they could change it if they wished. Stormhoof is a fine name, her father said, running his hand along the horse's neck. Strong, good for a working horse. They led both horses to the barn, settling Stormhoof into the empty stall they had prepared. The old horse watched from his own stall, ears pricked forward, making soft nickering sounds at the stranger. They fed both animals and gave them water, and the farmer spent a long time with the old horse, stroking his face, thanking him for his years of service. Tomorrow he would go to his new home, to a gentler life, and she wanted him to know he had been valued, had been loved. Her husband reported news from Whiterun. The giant hunt had been successful, he said. The creature had been driven back toward the mountains, along with its mammoths, and the guards had established a watch to make sure it didn't return. No one had been seriously injured, though one man had broken his arm when his horse had spooked. The whole city was talking about it, and the Jarl had promised extra ale at the harvest festival to celebrate. They worked for a few more hours in the afternoon, making good progress. The field was more than half cleared now, and if they maintained this pace, they would finish the harvest with 2 days to spare before the festival. That would give them time to thresh the grain, bag it properly, load the cart, and transport it to Whiterun for sale and trade. As evening approached, they quit for the day and returned to the house. Her husband tended to both horses, feeding them and brushing them down, getting Stormhoof accustomed to his new home and routine. The farmer prepared dinner, a thick soup with vegetables and barley, and they ate together while discussing the next day's work. Her father suggested they should take the old horse to Whiterun first thing in the morning, before starting the day's harvest. It would be hard to part with him, but better to do it early and get it over with. They could use Stormhoof to pull the small cart, let him get used to working with them. Her husband agreed, and so it was decided. That night the farmer lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sounds of the house and farm settling into darkness. 2 horses in the barn now instead of 1, half a field harvested, the festival drawing closer, changes and continuations, the old making way for the new, the cycle turning as it always did. She thought about her mother, about the generations of farmers who had worked this land, about the children she and her husband hoped to have someday, who would learn these same lessons, walk these same fields, feel this same connection to earth and sky and growing things. Eventually she slept and dreamed of golden grain and clear skies, of horses running free across the plains, of music and dancing at a festival that celebrated the gifts of summer and the promise of harvests yet to come. The 6th morning carried a weight of bittersweet purpose. The young farmer woke before dawn, as had become her habit, and dressed quietly in the grey light. Today they would say goodbye to the old horse, and though she knew it was the right thing to do, the knowing did not make it easier. She went to the barn before anything else, before even starting the kitchen fire, and spent time with the old fellow, stroking his neck and speaking softly. He seemed to sense something was different, shifting restlessly in his stall, but he nuzzled her hand when she offered it, his whiskers soft against her palm. She had brought him an apple from their small orchard, slightly wrinkled from storage but still sweet, and he crunched it happily, juice dripping from his lips. Such simple pleasures. She hoped his new life would be full of them. Her husband joined her after a while, and together they prepared both horses. Stormhoof would pull their small cart for the first time, carrying the old horse's tack and belongings to Whiterun. It seemed fitting somehow, the new horse helping to transition the old one to his retirement. Stormhoof stood patient while they fitted him with the harness, and though he tossed his head once or twice, he accepted the equipment without fuss. Her father came out as they were hitching Stormhoof to the cart, and he stood for a long moment looking at the old horse. His weathered hand reached out, trembling slightly, and rested on the horse's face. "You've been a good friend," he said, his voice thick. "Better than most people. You earned your rest." They set out for Whiterun as the sun rose, her husband leading Stormhoof in the cart, the old horse tied loosely behind, walking at his own pace. Her father had chosen to stay at the farm, saying his goodbyes privately, and the farmer understood. Some griefs were easier borne alone. The road to Whiterun was quiet this early, with only a few other farmers making their way toward the city with goods to trade. The morning air was cool and pleasant, and the old horse walked steadily, showing no signs of distress. If anything, he seemed curious, looking around with pricked ears, as if this final journey held interest for him. At the stables, the stable master greeted them warmly and introduced them to the farm boy who would be learning on the old horse. The boy was perhaps 12, gangly and nervous, with gentle hands and a kind face. He approached the old horse slowly, speaking in a soft voice, and the horse lowered his head, allowing the boy to stroke him. The farmer felt some of the tightness in her chest ease. This would be good for both of them. They completed the transaction, signing the papers that transferred ownership, and the stable master counted out a small amount of coin in addition to the horse trade they had already made. "He's a good old fellow," the stable master said. "He'll teach the boy well, and when his time comes, it'll be peaceful. You have my word." That was all she could ask for. She embraced the old horse one final time, breathing in his familiar scent, then stepped back and let her husband lead her away. She did not look back. Looking back would only make it harder. They stopped at the market on their way out of the city, purchasing a few supplies they would need for the festival. Cloth for wrapping their grain display, ribbons for decoration, a small cask of ale for celebrating. The merchants were busy, everyone preparing for the festival now, and the excitement in the air was palpable. Musicians were rehearsing in the town square, and workers were building stages and booths for the various competitions and displays. On the walk home, Stormhoof proved his worth, pulling the loaded cart smoothly and responding well to commands. Her husband was pleased, and they talked about how much easier the autumn ploughing would be with such a strong horse. The old horse had done his best, but his best had been growing weaker each season. Stormhoof would serve them for many years to come if they cared for him properly. Back at the farm, her father was waiting, and though his eyes were red-rimmed, he asked no questions. They simply returned to work, taking up their scythes and baskets and heading to the fields. The harvest continued, row after row falling before their blades, the pile of bundled grain growing ever larger. They worked through the day, stopping only for a brief lunch and water breaks. The sun beat down, hot and relentless, but there was a satisfaction in the labour, in seeing the field slowly empty and knowing that each bundle represented food and income, security for the coming winter. Around mid-afternoon, a neighbour stopped by, bringing fresh bread and asking to borrow their grain flail for after his own harvest. They talked for a while about the festival, about who was entering which competitions, about the giant that had been driven away, and the rumours of dragon sightings near Riverwood. "Strange times," the neighbour said, shaking his head. "Dragons and civil war, and who knows what else. Makes you appreciate the simple things. A good harvest, healthy family, full belly." The farmer agreed. The world beyond their farm might be full of turmoil and danger, but here, for now, things were good. They had what they needed, and a little more besides. That was wealth, of a kind that couldn't be measured in septims. As evening fell, and they finished another section of field, her husband declared they would take a rest day tomorrow. "We're ahead of schedule," he said, "and we're all exhausted. One day to recover, to prepare the barn for threshing, to rest our bodies. Then we finish the harvest and start processing the grain." Her father protested at first, but even he had to admit they were worn thin. The work had been hard, and they had been at it for days with little break. A day of lighter tasks would do them good, would let their muscles recover, and their hands heal from the blisters and calluses. That night, after a simple dinner of soup and bread, they sat together by the fire, too tired for much conversation. The dogs lay sprawled at their feet, and outside, Stormhoof moved about in his stall, still exploring his new home. The farmer found herself thinking about the old horse, hoping he was settling in well at the stables, hoping the boy was treating him kindly. She would probably never know, would never see him again, and there was a sadness in that. But life on a farm meant accepting such partings, understanding that everything had its season, its time. Her husband reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently, and she squeezed back. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the house settling around them, and outside the stars came out one by one, keeping watch over the farm and the half-harvested fields and all the sleeping things that waited for dawn. The seventh day was gentle, a respite from the hard labour of harvest. The young farmer woke naturally, without the urgent need to rise before dawn, and lay for a moment in the soft morning light, listening to her husband's steady breathing beside her. Her body ached in a dozen places, muscles protesting the days of repetitive work, but it was a manageable ache, one that would ease with rest. They took breakfast slowly, lingering over tea and porridge, discussing the lighter tasks of the day. The barn needed to be organised for threshing, a space cleared and swept where they could beat the grain from the stalks without losing any to the dirt. The tools needed cleaning and maintenance. Stormhoof needed more training, getting used to their voices and commands. Her father wanted to check the beehives they kept at the edge of the property, see if there was honey ready to harvest. After breakfast, her husband took Stormhoof out to the empty pasture to work with him, teaching him commands and building trust between horse and human. The farmer watched for a while from the garden, seeing how willing the young gelding was, how eager to please. He would be a good horse, she could already tell. Different from the old fellow, more energetic and less patient, but good in his own way. She turned her attention to the garden, which had been somewhat neglected during the intense harvest days. Weeds had taken advantage of her inattention, and she spent the morning pulling them, checking each plant for health and ripeness. The tomatoes were coming in well, fat and red on the vine. The herbs needed trimming, and she gathered sage and thyme and rosemary, bundling them to hang and dry in the kitchen. The garden had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could think and work at her own pace. where the results of her care were immediately visible. Her father spent the morning with the beehives, moving slowly and carefully as he smoked the bees and checked the frames. The farmer joined him after finishing her garden work, and together they extracted several frames heavy with honey. The bees hummed around them, not aggressive but watchful, and she felt the same wonder she always did at these tiny creatures and their industrious labour. The honey was golden and thick, and they would save most of it for winter, when its sweetness would be especially welcome. By midday they had collected nearly a full bucket of honey, and her father declared it a good yield. They carried it back to the house, where they strained it through cloth to remove any wax or bee parts, then poured it into clay jars for storage. The kitchen smelled amazing, rich and sweet, and they spread some on bread for their lunch, enjoying the fruits of the bees' labour. In the afternoon, the farmer worked in the barn with her husband, organising the space for threshing. They swept thoroughly, making sure no grain would be lost to cracks in the floor or hidden corners. They set up the threshing floor in the centre, a large smooth area where they could beat the grain stalks with flails to separate the grain from the chaff. It was tedious work, threshing, but necessary. The grain had to be cleaned and prepared properly if it was to be sold or stored. As they worked, a merchant's wagon rumbled past on the road, heading toward Whiterun. The merchant called out a greeting, and they waved back. The traffic on the road had increased as the festival approached, merchants and travellers and farmers all converging on the city. Soon their own wagon would join that traffic, loaded with sacks of grain, headed to market. Her father spent the afternoon repairing some of the chicken wire on the coop, patching holes where the dogs had been digging underneath. The chickens wandered about, scratching in the dirt, utterly unconcerned with the preparations happening around them. The broody hen was still sitting on her nest, and the farmer checked on her, making sure she had food and water within easy reach. Any day now, the chicks would start hatching, tiny balls of fluff that would grow into next year's layers. As evening approached, they took turns bathing in the wooden tub they kept in the back room, washing away days of accumulated dirt and sweat. The water was cold, drawn from the well, but it felt wonderful, refreshing and revitalizing. The farmer washed her hair, combing out the tangles, feeling more human than she had in days. For dinner, she made something special, using some of the honey to glaze a roasted chicken, serving it with fresh vegetables and bread still warm from the oven. They ate well, savouring the meal, and afterward her father brought out a bottle of mead he had been saving. They each had a small cup, toasting to their progress, to the good weather that had held, to the festival to come. As darkness fell, they sat outside for a while, enjoying the cool evening air. Fireflies danced in the garden, tiny points of light appearing and disappearing. The dogs lay nearby, content and relaxed. Stormhoof was quiet in his stall, settling into the rhythms of his new home. Tomorrow they would return to the harvest, would work hard until the last of the barley was cut and bundled. But tonight they could rest, could enjoy this moment of peace and accomplishment. The farmer looked up at the stars, finding the constellations her mother had taught her. The lover, the shadow, the steed, patterns of light in the darkness, constant and eternal. She thought about the cycle of seasons, of planting and growing and harvesting, of birth and death and renewal. Everything connected, everything part of the great turning wheel of life. Her husband's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining. They sat in comfortable silence, and she felt deeply grateful for this life, for this place, for the people she shared it with. The festival would be joyous, the winter would be comfortable, and spring would come again, bringing new challenges and new hopes. But for now, For this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The 8th day dawned with renewed purpose. The rest had done them all good, and the young farmer felt strong and ready as she rose to greet the morning. Today they would finish the harvest, cut the last of the barley and bundle it, and tomorrow they would begin threshing. The festival was only 3 days away now, and excitement mixed with determination as they prepared for the day's work. The sky was cloudless, promising another hot day, and she made sure everyone drank plenty of water before they headed to the fields. Stormhoof would work today too, her husband had decided, pulling a small sled they used for moving heavy loads. It would be his first real work for them, a test of his training and temperament. They worked with focused intensity, the three of them moving through the remaining barley like a well-oiled machine. Her father called the rhythm, his voice steady and sure, and they fell into it naturally. Swing, cut, gather, bind, swing, cut, gather, bind. The sun climbed higher and sweat soaked through their clothes, but they did not slow. There was an end in sight now, and that made all the difference. Stormhoof proved himself admirably, pulling the loaded sled back and forth between field and barn without complaint. Her husband praised him constantly, rewarding him with pats and kind words, and the horse seemed to understand that he was doing well, that he was valued. The difference between him and the old horse was stark. Where the old fellow had pulled slowly and needed frequent rests, Stormhoof worked tirelessly, his strength seemingly endless. By midday they had cleared 3/4 of the remaining field. The farmer's hands were raw despite the calluses, and her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, but she pushed through. Her father was flagging. She could see it in the way he moved, the pauses between swings of his scythe growing longer. She suggested he rest, and this time he agreed without argument, settling in the shade of the barn with a cup of water and the dogs for company. She and her husband continued alone, working side by side in the hot sun. They spoke little, saving their energy for the labour, but there was communication in their movements, in the way they coordinated without needing words. After years of working together, they had developed an almost telepathic understanding, each knowing what the other needed before it was asked. In the mid-afternoon, a group of travellers passed on the road, merchants by the look of their wagon. They stopped to buy eggs, and the farmer gladly sold them 2 dozen, grateful for the break in the coin. The merchants were heading to the festival, they said, planning to set up a booth selling fabrics and notions from Cyrodiil. They had come all the way from Bruma, travelling for weeks, and they spoke of the road conditions and news from the south. The empire was stronger now than it had been, one merchant said, since the end of the war. Trade was recovering, people were rebuilding. There was hope again. After the merchants left, the farmer returned to the field with renewed energy. The empire's recovery meant their recovery too. Strong trade routes meant better prices for grain, more buyers at the festival. Everything was connected, from the largest political movements down to their small farm on the plains outside Whiterun. As the sun began its descent toward evening, they cut the last row of barley. Her husband swung his scythe through the final stalks, and then it was done. The entire field lay harvested, bundled, ready for processing. They stood together looking at their work, at the neat rows of bundles and the empty field, and the farmer felt a surge of fierce pride. They had done it. Despite the rain and delays, despite her father's aging body and the need to replace the horse, despite all the small challenges and worries, they had brought in the harvest. Her father came out to join them, moving slowly but smiling broadly. He walked into the field and knelt, pressing his hand to the stubble, and the farmer saw his lips moving in silent prayer or thanksgiving. When he stood, there were tears on his cheeks, but he brushed them away quickly. "Your mother would be proud," he said simply, and that was all that needed to be said. They worked for another hour, moving the last of the bundles to the barn, filling it completely with the golden stalks. The space they had cleared for threshing was now surrounded by their harvest, and tomorrow they would begin the long process of separating grain from chaff. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, they would celebrate. The farmer prepared a feast, using ingredients she had been saving for this moment. Roasted pork from a pig they had butchered in the spring, preserved with salt and herbs, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from the garden, roasted with oil and spices, apple tarts sweetened with their honey, and the last of the mead poured generously. As they ate, they talked about the festival, about which competitions they might enter, about how much they hoped to earn from selling their grain. Her father told more stories from past festivals, about the year he had won the axe-throwing competition, about the time her mother had entered her preserves and won a ribbon. The farmer listened, committing these stories to memory, knowing that someday she would tell them to her own children, keeping the family history alive through words and remembrance. After dinner, as full darkness fell, they heard music in the distance. Someone in Whiterun was practicing for the festival, the sound of a lute or flute carrying across the plains. It was a cheerful tune, quick and lively, and the farmer found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm. Her husband noticed and pulled her to her feet, spinning her around the kitchen in an impromptu dance. Her father clapped along, laughing, and for a few minutes they forgot their tired bodies and sore hands and simply enjoyed the moment. Later, lying in bed with her husband already asleep beside her, the farmer reflected on the day. The harvest was in. Tomorrow would bring new work, but a different kind, less urgent, more methodical. And in 3 days, the festival. She imagined it, the crowds and music, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread, the competitions and displays, the chance to see friends and neighbours they hadn't visited with in months. It would be wonderful, a celebration of all they had accomplished, a reward for the summer's hard work. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the darkness, and Stormhoof shifted in his stall, settling for the night. The farm was quiet and peaceful, and she closed her eyes and let sleep take her, satisfied and content. The 9th day was dedicated to threshing, the laborious process of separating the grain from the stalks. The young farmer woke to another beautiful morning, the sky clear and bright, perfect weather for working in the barn. They would need the good airflow to help winnow the chaff from the grain, and the dry conditions would keep the grain from spoiling. After breakfast, they gathered in the barn with their flails, wooden tools with a long handle and a shorter striking piece connected by a cord. The technique required practice and rhythm, and her father demonstrated for them, showing how to swing the flail so it came down squarely on the grain stalks spread across the threshing floor. The impact separated the grain from the stalks, and the seeds would fall through to be collected below. They worked in shifts, taking turns with the flails because the motion was exhausting. Swing up, bring down, listen for the satisfying crack of the flail against the stalks. Over and over, hour after hour. The barn filled with dust and chaff, making them cough and squint, but they persisted. Between shifts, whoever was resting would gather the threshed stalks and move them aside, checking to make sure all the grain had been knocked free. Stormhoof spent the day in the pasture, enjoying a well-earned rest. The farmer checked on him during one of her breaks, bringing him an apple and brushing his coat until it shone. He leaned into the brushing, clearly enjoying the attention, and she felt the bond between them strengthening. He was theirs now, truly part of the family, and he seemed to understand and accept his place. By midday, they had threshed about a third of the harvest. The grain was collecting in a pile on the swept floor, and it looked good. Plump kernels, not too many broken ones, a nice golden colour. Her father examined it critically, running it through his fingers, and declared himself satisfied. "Good yield," he said. "Better than I'd hoped, considering all that rain. The barley did well." They broke for lunch, sitting outside in the shade to escape the dust of the barn. The farmer had prepared cold chicken and fresh bread, with cheese and late summer apples. They ate slowly, resting their arms and shoulders, drinking plenty of water. The work was hard, but there was something meditative about the rhythm of it, the repeated motion, the gradual transformation of stalks into grain. In the afternoon, a neighbour arrived, asking if they could borrow Stormhoof for a few hours. His own horse had gone lame, and he needed to move some heavy timber. The farmer's husband agreed readily. Neighbours helped neighbours, and they owed this man for assistance he had given them in the past. They hitched Stormhoof to the neighbour's cart, and the horse went willingly, seeming to enjoy the variety. With Stormhoof gone and her husband helping the neighbour, the farmer and her father continued threshing alone. The pace was slower with just two of them, but they managed. Her father told her about learning to thresh as a boy, about how his own father had taught him, about the tricks for getting the most grain with the least effort. She listened, absorbing not just the practical knowledge, but the connection to the past, to all the generations who had done this same work in this same place. As evening approached, her husband returned with Stormhoof, and the neighbour came too, bringing a basket of fresh fish he had caught that morning as thanks for the horse's help. The farmer accepted the fish gratefully. It would make a welcome change from their usual diet, and fish was good brain food, her mother had always said. They worked for another hour, making good progress, and then called it a day as the light began to fade. Dinner was the fresh fish, fried crispy in butter with herbs from the garden, served with boiled potatoes and greens. It was delicious, and they ate heartily, already looking forward to tomorrow. One more day of threshing and winnowing, and then they would bag the grain and be ready for the festival. That evening, they sat together mending the sacks they would use to transport the grain to Whiterun. The old burlap bags had seen many harvests, and they needed patches and reinforcement before they could be trusted with the precious cargo. The farmer's fingers moved automatically, needle and thread creating neat stitches, while her father worked on the larger tears. "Tomorrow night we should go into Whiterun," her husband suggested. "See the festival preparations, maybe listen to some of the musicians practicing. We've been working so hard. We deserve an evening of enjoyment before the busy day." Her father agreed enthusiastically. He loved music, always had, and the chance to hear the bards practicing their songs before the official festival began appealed to him. The farmer nodded her agreement. It would be nice to spend an evening in town, to feel part of the larger community, to remember that life was about more than just work. As they worked on the bags, her husband shared news he had heard from the neighbour. Apparently, there was talk of a special guest at the festival this year, a famous bard from Solitude who would be performing. The neighbour had heard her once years ago and said her voice could make you weep with its beauty. There would also be a competition for the best pie, and the winner would receive a silver prize and bragging rights for the entire year. "You should enter," her father said to the farmer. "Your apple tarts are as good as any I've tasted. Better even." She laughed, embarrassed but pleased. "Maybe," she said. "If we have time, there's still so much to do." But the idea took root in her mind. Why not enter? She made good pastry, and her apples were excellent this year. It would be fun at least, and winning would be a source of pride. She decided she would do it, would make her best tart and enter it in the competition. Her mother had won ribbons at the festival. Why shouldn't she try to do the same? As the evening deepened and the mending was finished, they prepared for bed. Tomorrow would be another long day, but the end was in sight. The festival loomed, bright and exciting, a reward for all their hard work. The farmer climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her mind already planning her pie recipe, thinking about the festival, imagining the music and crowds and celebration. It would be wonderful. All of it would be wonderful. The 10th day arrived with a sense of anticipation and completion. The young farmer woke early, eager to finish the threshing so they could enjoy their planned evening in Whiterun. The festival was tomorrow, and today felt like the threshold between work and celebration, the last push before the reward. They broke their fast quickly and went straight to the barn. The work went faster now that they had established their rhythm and technique. The flails rose and fell with practiced precision, and the pile of clean grain grew steadily. Her father worked more slowly today. She could see the cumulative exhaustion in his movements, but he refused to stop completely, insisting he could at least help with the easier tasks. By mid-morning, all the stalks had been threshed. Now came the winnowing, the process of separating the grain from the chaff. They carried the grain outside in large shallow baskets and tossed it into the air on the breeze. The heavier grain fell back into the baskets while the lighter chaff blew away. It was satisfying work, watching the grain grow cleaner and purer with each toss, seeing the golden kernels gleaming in the sunlight. Stormhoof watched from the pasture, and the chickens came to investigate, pecking at any grain that spilled. The dogs lay in the shade, panting in the growing heat. It was a perfect late summer day, warm but not oppressive, with a gentle breeze that made the winnowing easy. The farmer felt deeply content, surrounded by her family and animals, doing work that connected her to generations past and future. They worked steadily through the morning and into early afternoon. The grain was winnowed clean, then spread on cloths in the sun to dry completely. While it dried, they prepared the sacks, laying them out and checking each one for holes or weaknesses. Everything had to be perfect for tomorrow's journey to the festival. By mid-afternoon, the grain was dry and ready to be bagged. They worked together, scooping the grain into the sacks and tying them closed with strong cord. Each sack weighed as much as the farmer herself, and it took all of them working together to lift and stack them in the barn. They counted as they worked. 15 sacks in total, a good harvest by any measure. Her father looked at the stacked sacks with satisfaction, nodding slowly. This would see them through the winter with plenty to spare for selling. With the work finally finished, they cleaned themselves up and prepared for their evening in Whiterun. The farmer changed into her best dress, a simple but well-made garment of blue wool that her mother had sewn years ago. Her husband wore his good shirt and combed his hair. Her father took extra care with his appearance, trimming his beard and polishing his boots. They were farmers, yes, but tonight they would be festival goers, part of the celebration. They set out in the late afternoon, walking the familiar road as the sun began its descent. Other people were heading toward Whiterun too, everyone drawn by the music and excitement that preceded the official festival. The city gates stood open wide, and guards waved them through with smiles. The whole city felt different, alive with anticipation and joy. The main square had been transformed. Stages had been erected, booths set up, decorations hung everywhere. Musicians were tuning instruments and practicing, their melodies overlapping and creating a chaotic but wonderful symphony. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air, and vendors were calling out their wares. Children ran laughing between the booths, and adults stood in groups, talking and laughing. They wandered through the preparations, taking it all in. Her husband stopped to watch a strongman competitor practicing, lifting impossibly heavy weights. Her father found a group of older men discussing agriculture and joined their conversation enthusiastically. The farmer explored the various booths, noting where the pie competition would be held, where they would need to bring their grain tomorrow, where the dancing would take place. As evening fell, the official practice performances began. A stage had been set up, and various performers took turns showcasing their talents. There were jugglers and acrobats, a comedian who had the crowd roaring with laughter, a young bard whose voice was sweet and clear, and then the special guest arrived, the famous bard from Solitude. She was older than the farmer had expected, perhaps 50, with silver threading through her dark hair. But when she began to sing, age fell away. Her voice was extraordinary, rich and powerful, carrying across the square and silencing all other noise. She sang of love and loss, of heroes and dragons, of the beauty of Skyrim and the strength of its people. The farmer felt tears on her cheeks and wasn't ashamed. Around her, others were crying too, moved by the pure emotion in the music. After the performance, the crowd dispersed slowly, people reluctant to leave the magic behind. The farmer's family found a tavern and sat down for a real meal, not cooked by them for once. They ordered stew and bread and ale and ate while watching the other patrons, adventurers with tales of dungeons and dragons, merchants discussing trade routes, guards relaxing after their shifts. Her father raised his mug in a toast. "To the harvest," he said, "to this family, to your mother, who would have loved to see this day." They drank, the ale bitter and cold and perfect. The farmer felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The work was done. The festival awaited. Life was good, here in this moment, surrounded by people she loved in a city that was celebrating the fruits of summer's labour. As they walked home later, full and content and slightly tipsy from the ale, the stars came out overhead. The road was dark, but they knew it by heart, could have walked it blindfolded. Ahead, their farm waited, the empty fields that would lie fallow now until autumn ploughing, the barn full of grain, the animals sleeping in their various places. Tomorrow they would return to Whiterun with their harvest, would sell their grain and enter the pie competition, would dance and celebrate and enjoy the festival properly. But tonight, walking home in the darkness with her husband's hand in hers and her father humming a tune from the bard's performance, the farmer felt complete. This was what she had worked for, not just the harvest itself, but this moment, this feeling of accomplishment and connection and joy. They reached the farm and checked on the animals, gave Stormhoof a final pat, locked the chickens safely away from foxes. The dogs greeted them and settled at their feet. Inside, the house was dark and cool, and they went to bed without ceremony, too tired and happy for anything but sleep. The farmer lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of home, and thought about tomorrow. The festival, the celebration, the beginning of autumn, and the slow turn toward winter. But that was tomorrow. Tonight she was simply grateful for this life, this land, this love. And that was enough, more than enough, everything.